Welcome to Health versus Wealth with Dr. Ben, where each week it's my great pleasure to meet fascinating people who tell us about the challenges they're facing with their work-life balance. I'm Dr. Ben Sinclair, and I wonder, do you struggle with your priorities? On the one hand, focusing on your work, business or career, namely your wealth, or on the other hand, looking after your health, which is so important. Over the past 20 years as a GP, I've seen many people spending too long on their screens, cutting corners on their sleep, diet or exercise. The result? Their work life's going well, but their health can suffer. I sincerely hope that my guests' personal and professional experiences may help you to improve your own health and life. Welcome. My guest today takes a somewhat unusual view of health and wealth, which he maybe sees in a different perspective to some of you listening. Now that could be because, like his father before him, he's a vicar in the Church of England. Rather than calculate his wealth in terms of money or income, he sees wealth as the impact on the people in his parish. His take on health is different from many others too, as he spent the past 18 months struggling with the effects of long COVID, just like 2.5 million people are currently doing in the UK today. Chris Mitton, welcome.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you for coming in. And how is your long COVID recovery journey going, and how are you feeling?
I am probably feeling about 80% better. So I've had long COVID for pushing 18 months. I've had some highs and lows. It's kind of like a wobbly uphill kind of recovery thing, isn't it? You go up a bit, then you go back a bit, you go up a bit. I'm pretty much full-time at work again, but I'm not yet back to things like running and exercise as I was before. Still some kind of low-level brain fog, headaches, but the trajectory is good.
That's good to hear. Now, we're going to talk more about long COVID later.
Yes.
But I'd love to find out for the listeners a bit more about you. You were born in Kidderminster in Worcestershire, then you grew up in Derby. Now, both of your parents were involved in church work, but early on, I gather, another subject apart from church appealed to you more at first?
Yeah, so I was one of those kids who was kind of like an all-rounder at school. And so that was lovely in one way because I did okay in the subjects, but it was difficult in another way because I couldn't choose what to do. But art ended up being something which I enjoyed. I loved the potential for exploring ideas and for communicating. Just different concepts, thoughts, ideas, messages through the medium of art. So as school kind of went along, I sort of gradually filtered out what my friends call the proper subjects of like biology and chemistry and physics and so on, and focused in on the art room. Interesting.
But you're not an artist now, so
no.
Something else won over.
That's right.
Now, I hear that you were quite a shy teenager, but then between school and uni, you went off to Africa. Tell us how that changed you.
Yeah, so I had pretty significant, I'd say, social anxiety as a teenager through school. Very, very shy. I'd go through pretty much whole school days barely saying a word to anyone. And then finished school, did an art foundation year, went off to Malawi, and that required me to then start doing a lot more kind of public speaking stuff, which for me was the worst thing ever because if you have social anxiety, then having to stand up in front of a room full of people and speak was really difficult. And it was near the beginning of our time in Malawi that we were doing some work up by Lake Malawi, which is stunningly beautiful. And it was a Christian project I was working with out there, and so they had a sort of morning devotional on the shores of Lake Malawi under this open-sided gazebo tent kind of thing, and they asked me to give a short message, and I was terrified. Like I didn't have a good night's sleep. It was like a 5-minute talk, but I stood up and I spoke and shared what was on my heart to speak. And I think I'd never felt so, you know when you find the thing that you're really meant to do, something just comes alive, and I never felt so alive in that way in what I was doing. And so I shared my message, probably not particularly well, sat down, it was done, it was over with, but there was something about it that I thought, this is connecting with my heart in a way that nothing I've done before is.
Wow. And what a setting. I've got visions of you getting in a boat and then calming the storm later.
That didn't happen. We had breakfast, but we never swim.
But a great setting to cut your teeth with public speaking and preaching.
Sure.
And so obviously that then, led you on to your current ministry.
That's right.
Now, when you came home from East Africa, you went north to God's own country.
Right, that's
Yorkshire.
right. Yeah, yes.
And we both have spent time in Yorkshire.
That's right.
Now, you were on a mission to do what in Yorkshire?
So initially I went up there to study art. I'd had my time in Malawi, but I'd obviously applied for my degree before that. Showed up to study on a contemporary art course and pretty quickly realised I wasn't very good at art compared to those I was studying alongside, who were, extraordinarily more talented than I was, and had this sort of awakening experience in Malawi too. I don't think this is quite the right road for me. So I switched courses to a joint honours in art history and theology. Began to do a lot more just sort of pastoral ministry work. University is a fascinating place for just people grappling with ideas, and so there was a lot of sort of just debating, conversations, late night chats with housemates, just about faith and life and all of it, and so then I finished up university and went on to do an internship at a church. Just so in some ways it was kind of like that vocational sense was just gradually narrowing down for where art was big ideas, communication concepts. Theology then started to narrow that kind of wanting to communicate something into the theological realm, and then that kind of then narrowed even further into some kind of church ministry and pastoral work with students, and just continuing that connection with students on campus, a little bit of local mission community work as well in the church I was working for, and so worked as a student pastor for a couple of years.
Wow, so you were drawn into more and more into that kind of pastoral role.
Exactly, yeah.
It's funny, and I think university is such a melting pot of ideas. I remember I once stayed up till 6 a.m. debating, because I was in the Territorial Army at the time.
Sure.
I was debating with the head of the Third World First charity at the university whether Jesus was a pacifist and whether I should join the army or not.
Yes.
And in the end, I didn't join the army, but I don't think Jesus was a pacifist.
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting debate that we had. Okay. And we continued all these sort of things till 6 a.m.
Yes, which you can do at university, because you studied a proper degree and did medicine, but theology and art history wasn't a high demand on my time.
Now, Chris, on my show, guests often talk about their wealth, meaning income.
Yes.
How do you evaluate wealth differently?
Yeah, so if you're a Church of England vicar, you're not normally in the wealthy category of people. But you meet so many fascinating people, and you tend to end up ministering with people across the spectrum. And I think one of the things that often you observe just through that connection with people across life is that you can be fabulously wealthy materially. You can have loads of money in the bank account, but you can also in that place have quite a significant deficit of your internal life. You can be in quite significant simplicity of your material possessions, but can be overflowing with a full and rich and abundant inner life. And so the idea of happiness and well-being, if we're going to hold that into the idea of wealth, actually is far bigger than just what's in my bank account. There's a fascinating book in the Old Testament which was written by basically a guy called King Solomon, who was kind of like the health and wealth guru of the Old Testament story. He was a king with incredible wisdom, and because he was so wise, he built the kingdom to a position of phenomenal prosperity. He was eating off golden plates and drinking out of golden goblets. The descriptions of the wealth of his moment was extraordinary. But then he writes this kind of reflection on it in the book of Ecclesiastes, and he kind of explores these themes and says, I tried to get as wealthy as a person could get to, but he said, but it felt like it lacked substance in my soul. He said, I tried to create the most beautiful palaces and buildings and gardens. I tried to seek fulfillment through purpose, but it left me with this kind of feeling of this is insubstantial in my soul. He said, I tried to get loads of wives and in the ancient world concubines and basically get happy through loads and loads and loads of sex. He said, but it left me with this deep deficit in my soul. And so he kind of tries to whittle life down to almost what is a wealthy life at the core of it. You can have everything that you seek for, career success, money in the bank account, fabulous holidays, but it can all feel very, very empty. And actually we just have to look at the lives of celebrities, billionaires, whatever, or those people who we read their books and read their stories and try and emulate them. But often what we find behind the scenes is that actually they've been absent parents to their children, or they've had dysfunctional marriages, or their mental health has been shot, or they've been grappling with addiction, or they've been, there's been sort of power abuse in how they've managed the staff and people around them. And so often actually just if we narrow the idea of wealth to simply what's in my bank account, we just get a very impoverished view of what life is truly about. So for me, it has to go for something richer and deeper, because I don't want to get to the end of my life and think, well, I'm not going to do this because I'm a vicar, and we don't get there. But I wouldn't want to get to the end of my life and think I've amassed a fortune, but I've neglected my children, or I've got incredibly wealthy, but actually my marriage was in tatters, or I achieved everything I could ever want to achieve, but my neighbours thought I was a complete idiot. Whatever it might be. There's got to be something more essentially deep about what it means to live a life that is enriched.
And well thought out. And actually, you say, because I'm a vicar, but there are still vicars who've gone power crazy and who have neglected their lives, marriages,
100%,
children,
100%.
Gone for power, gone for money, the TV evangelists. So I think none of us are immune.
That's right.
Even though we're coming from a sort of a values-based proposition.
That's right.
But were you not tempted early on? You got A grades all the way through school. There are much more lucrative careers than being a vicar. Why didn't you take that road? You were an A grade student.
Yeah, so I think I've always been quite values driven. My granddad, actually, who I dearly loved, he really wanted me to go into law, and he'd been big in business. He'd done exceptionally well. Drove a big Rolls Royce. They drove down to France for holidays and so on. He'd done really, really well, and I loved him so much. But I think I'd always been I've always been quite a values-driven person, and I was soaked in this, I went to a public school, and so it was quite a wealthy culture. Honestly, I think I just felt like money is a beautiful tool if you have it. You can resource things. I'd love to be able to take our kids to Alton Towers and have steak every Friday night, and all that stuff. But actually, there also seemed to be a very shallow bottom to that pool that a lot of my peers kind of were living in at school. And for me, the thought of doing something simply to make money out of it, I was like, that's not going to cut it for actually what I'm wanting to experience out of life. You get one life, right? You want to live it to the fullest. And when I looked at how that kind of wealth chasing thing could go, I just thought, for me, that's just not going to be deep enough.
Well, even the Beatles said money can't buy you love.
Right.
So they had lots of money and they understood it as well,
Right.
And I guess they were into spirituality.
We've all known people who have been fabulously wealthy, fabulously successful, fabulously healthy, and yet have had an empty vacuum within them of just feeling like they're devoid of something. I would say that vacuum is the longing that we have for a connection with the God for whom we are made. And so people believe lots of different things about the word spirituality, but for me, it's primarily a relational term. And so, when I think about people who I've ministered to, prayed with, I've prayed with people on their deathbeds. That's a raw time. That confronts you with the essential things of life. But I've been there with people who, in that moment, people of deep faith, have got to that place and not even been able to speak anymore, but have had nothing left in their eyes and their ways but just love. Love, an extraordinary peace. And you think in that moment, that's not a moment where the world's going to look on and say, you've got health, obviously. No one's going to look on and say it's wealthy or circumstances that we want to be in. Yet there's something fundamental about the soul of that person who has lost everything that everyone else in the world would be chasing, but has kept that core thing for which we were created, the only thing which we can carry through death, which is a connection to the God who made us. So, to my understanding of the way we were made, it all sits in that core place of, if we were made by a good, loving creator God, then unless that relationship is in place at the core of all that we do, then every other part of our health will dysfunction. But if it is right, if we've got that thing in place, then actually our emotional health, our relational health, our physical health, they can all just pour out from that center.
Welcome back to Health versus Wealth. For those of you joining us late, I'm with Chris Mitton, a Church of England vicar who has been suffering from long COVID and has a very different view on what constitutes health and wealth. Now, Chris, it's been said that no one on their deathbed ever wished they spent more time at work.
Right.
And, listening to you talking about ministering to people who are who are dying is really powerful in that respect, because what we're talking about is the core values that resonate here.
Yes.
And I've worked in hospices,
Sure,
caring for the dying as well, and
yes.
I do think at the end of the day we are the sum of our, essentially, what's left is us of values and beliefs and our relationships. You can't take it with you.
Sure.
But what I notice about this connection and spirituality more generally is that people do identify with some things that are non-religious that they resonate with on a spiritual level. So
yes.
You talked about art earlier.
Yes.
A lot of people resonate with sort of creation, with animals, with the created order.
Yes.
What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, so I think sometimes we like to compartmentalise, don't we? And I can have my my spiritual health box over here, and my mental health box over here, and my physical health box, and I can get all the boxes nicely set up. I don't think it works like that. So before I had long COVID, I was a runner, and for me the best running was fell running, and so I love the elevation, the scenery. I love the weather, good and bad. Like having a run in the driving rain on the side of a mountain is a powerful experience, right? You feel alive. I'd go wild swimming with my kids. Now, some people might say that's not a spiritual experience because it doesn't happen sitting cross-legged on the floor or kneeling in a church or something. I would say it's a deeply spiritual experience, and I think that's partly what I mean by spirituality sits at the core. Actually, it sits at the core because spirituality invades all parts of our life. A great meal, to me, is like, it's not just, I'm hungry, or that's delicious. It's like, this is a spiritual experience. So I think there's a kind of like a connection, actually, very much in Christian theology between the spiritual, essential soul, breath of a person and the holistic embodied world in which we live. And I think many people actually experience that. So any fell runners out there might also know, I've been on a mountain and it was wild and it was wet, but I felt alive. Or when I jumped into that cold plunge pool in the Yorkshire Dales and it was terrifying and freezing, but I felt so invigorated. Or when I climbed that mountain, or when I had that amazing, there's something like in us that's like waiting to wake up. And I think we get those kind of little cracks in the window. C.S. Lewis, actually, he wrote about this. So most people know him as the guy who wrote the Narnia books, but he was a famous Christian apologist, philosopher, and I mean the intellect of the man was just ridiculous. But one of the things he wrote about was the quality of joy, and he described it as almost like those moments when there's like an awakening of something within, kind of like a transcendental moment where you feel a connection and an aliveness in yourself to something beautiful or something wonderful or something still, which could happen in front of a piece of art. It could happen before that magnificent sunrise on Lake Malawi. It could happen just sometimes when I've had moments in the last year and a half where I've just been sitting in the garden with long COVID when there's nothing else I can do. And yet there's been a kind of like quality of life present, which just feels more. Lewis, he wrote about that as the presence of joy. And that joy sometimes comes and surprises you. But I think actually it's a bigger concept which we can link to all these different parts, where actually spirituality is really, it's the recognition that the human experience is wider than we often narrow it down to.
I love that definition. I think that really fits well. So I don't have to disagree with you that spirituality is one of the core now of what we describe. And we often at Dr. Finley's talked about this sort of well-being pyramid, balancing our spiritual health with social health, mental health, and physical health. You've just given me a new definition. I may have to rewrite my model, Chris, but I'm going to take that away and think about it.
Right.
Now, you mentioned your long COVID experience, which is a real challenge we've both experienced.
Yes. Yeah.
You caught COVID Easter 2023.
That's right.
And then long COVID followed. Now, tell us more about your experience. How are you coping? What advice would you give to other people suffering from long COVID?
Yeah, so it was the first time, funnily enough, I'd had symptomatic COVID. Easter 2023, I took 2 days off work and then went back to work at the usual rate. And I basically then gradually deteriorated as I tried to do what I've done with every other illness for life, which was I'll be all right, I'll push through.
And also, knowing you, Chris, I know your usual rate is actually pretty high powered.
Yeah.
And, you have evening meetings with, church leadership teams, you're visiting people, you're looking after people at a pretty high speed. So I just want to clarify, for a clergyman vicar, it's more like working like a banker in terms of, nose to the grindstone, I think.
Yes.
But so you were working quite hard when you went back to work.
I was, yeah, and I think I was probably resting hard as well, if you know what I mean. So Saturday morning, I'd get up at 6, and I'd take whichever kids were up for a fell run in the hills. But those runs were getting slower and slower, and I was getting tighter and tighter. And I've always been quite an active person. I like to get things done, and so I basically tried that for 3 months of gradual deterioration. And then I hit the first time I've ever felt it in my life. I literally can't do anything else. I'd moved to working in bed on my laptop because I was so tired, and I hadn't realised I'm sick. And I was slouched in my bed one day, like with barely my head pretty much resting on my chin and my laptop resting on my stomach. And I hit a simple problem, and I thought I literally haven't got any brain power to fix this. And actually, my first appointment with you was the next day.
Wow.
When you said, this might be long COVID.
Well, I think you'd said to me that you were, beginning to hit a wall.
Yes.
And lots of people with long COVID, who are sort of type A people or, sort of highly motivated, keep going.
Yes,
and my mistake was the same. I kept running every day thinking, I'll just blow off the cobwebs.
Sure.
But it got worse and worse.
And I think that's partly why a lot of type A people are getting it. Because I'm pretty sure if I'd have rested properly to begin with, I may not have got as low as I got.
And absolutely, and one of the things we say is rest early to recover quicker.
Right. Yeah. Completely. Yeah.
So I think that's one piece of advice is if you think you're getting fatigue like you've never experienced before, take note.
Yes.
Because a doctor and a vicar who are pretty into well-being still haven't identified the signs of that in their own lives.
Yeah. It's not just you. You're not just being weird. Because you do all these things like, I just need to try harder. I just need to show up more. I of course I can go for a run. Sometimes you feel tired, but you push through anyway.
It's all the platitudes. Pain is weakness leaving the body.
Exactly.
As the SEAL team say. Yes. And I was running thinking, fatigue is just leaving my body, but I didn't get it didn't fatigue work. Leaving. It got worse and worse. So what other advice would you have for people with long COVID?
Yeah, so I think, let me do a simple one, a medical one, and then maybe a sort of like a bit more of the kind of internal workings of the mind of the vicar. So the medical one was the biggest difference for me was antihistamines. I'd never taken them before, never had hay fever before. But after having COVID, I had a cough for that 3 months of fatigue. Couldn't shift it, just kept on going. We had our first appointment. You said try taking antihistamines. In 24 hours, the cough had completely gone. 2 weeks later, I did what I've always done and thought, I don't need meds, I'll just get rid of them and stop taking them. Within 24 hours, the cough had come back.
Interesting.
Fascinating. And so then I went back onto them, and again, it completely disappeared. Now, I then was a good boy for a few months and kept on them until about November. Then I thought, I'm taking them twice a day. I'm going to drop to just one in the morning. So just having an antihistamine in the morning, I didn't make the connection, but I then started waking up every night for 2 to 3 hours every night. I did that for 3 weeks, every single night, waking up for 2 to 3 hours, driving me nuts. Like, you're trying to rest, you're trying to get better, couldn't sleep. We then had an appointment. You said, Chris, have you stopped taking your antihistamine in the evening? I said, funnily enough, yes, I have. And it was about the time I stopped sleeping.
So you were still trying to wind down the medicines perhaps quicker than you need to. By the way, I love the way the priest is confessing his health sins to the doctor here.
Forgive
it's
me,
normally
Father.
the other way around. I absolve you of all sin.
But
I think what I would say is sometimes we think that we can get better too quickly.
That's right.
And we ditch the supplements or whatever too fast.
Yes.
So how's your sleep and diet now? And what other thorny issues are you still having?
Yeah, I'll come there in a minute, but just before I do, so the other thing, so and just to finish that story, so once I took the antihistamine again, I was back to sleep fine every night. So that was the first thing. The second thing, and which has been the bigger part of the journey for me, was learning to stop and learning to do nothing has been essential. Giving myself permission to just not be doing things has been the single most challenging and actually the single most restorative thing for me, both in terms of my actually physical health, mental health and spiritual health, I'd say. Learning that I don't have to be doing all the time. but there are very strong, if you're a type A person and you're used to high achievement, there are very, very strong internal narratives that are flowing like a current in your brain. And every time you have to choose to stop, it's like you're swimming in the other direction. But it's essential. It's that permission to be kind to self. Psychotherapists talk about it as the soothe mechanism.
What residual symptoms do you have left now?
Yes.
How's your sleep and diet and things now?
Yeah. So my sleep's great now. Really, really good. I've learned to sleep more than I was sleeping before. I think I maybe need to a little bit, but I also think maybe before I wasn't giving my body the sleep that it needed. And so actually now I've just worked that self-care in. My diet is, so I intermittent fast every day till sort of probably about 9:30. So that gives me about a 13, 14 hour fasting window.
So people who don't do that, just to clarify, you're essentially not eating deliberately for a time to go into a low insulin state.
Yes.
To promote ketosis, which helps to regenerate cells, detoxify, get out the trash, and actually your brain loves ketones, which are burning fat, and so you can feel better and actually heal quicker that way.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Then diet-wise, I've gone to probably something a little more akin to a paleo, not pure paleo, but more that way. So I have a kind of like berry smoothie with homemade live yogurt and nuts and seeds for breakfast.
You're making me salivate now. This sounds lovely.
It's good. Yeah, it's great.
Sounds great. And you've got lots of stuff healthy in there. Lots of healthy bits.
Absolutely.
On the brain fog bit, and this is my final thought for the podcast. We know that brain fog is often due to neuroinflammation.
Yes.
And neuroinflammation is inflammation of the nervous system and the brain. And this is often caused by either COVID viral persistence, so you haven't cleared the virus that you caught, it's still there, causing you problems. And we do have a test to check for that, to see if that's actually there, because then we can look at treating that. And the second thing that causes it is vector-borne infections. Now, you mentioned you're a fell runner.
Yes.
A lot of us who love the outdoors have been bitten by bugs that are carrying bacterial infection.
Yes.
And we harbour these infections, and when we're well, that's not a problem. But ultimately, people like Miranda Hart are coming out saying they've actually been diagnosed with Lyme disease, which is a neuroinflammatory disease. So my final thought is we do need to think about Lyme disease and other vector-borne infections.
Yes.
Because they can cause this ongoing fatigue and brain fog that may have been triggered by an immune event that was COVID.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think there's supplements to help with that, so resveratrol, lion's mane, grapeseed extract, all these supplements that we're trying to take, which can help. But ultimately, if we don't reduce the cause, this bacterial overgrowth, we're never going to reduce the actual long-term complications.
Yes. Yeah.
So my one piece of advice is let's get tested for these vector-borne infections.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they're surprisingly common, especially in outdoorsy people like us.
Yes. Yeah. And I think my profile for the potential of that is probably quite high as well. And I've not been tested for Lyme disease as yet. But travel, like you say, wilderness activity. I even had a tick on my head as a child because we lived in Yorkshire as a kid for a few years as well. And the prevalence is high. 100% of the ticks in Northeast carry the Lyme disease bacteria. Chris, it's been fascinating talking to you. Sadly, we've run out of time, but I want to thank you for coming in today. It's been a pleasure finding out more about your spirituality. It's been an absolute pleasure being here, and just these connections between spirituality and health, just brilliant. So thank you for having me.
So I do hope you enjoyed today's episode of Health versus Wealth with Dr. Ben, and I hope it may help you improve your life and health. You can also take one easy step by achieving that right now by subscribing free on your usual podcast platform. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, you can email me on podcast@drfinlays.co.uk. I hope you'll join me again, but for now it's goodbye from me, Dr. Ben.